John Lennox is the former student of C.S. Lewis, and he's currently the professor of mathematics at Oxford University. He's become one of my favorite people in the world. He just kind of brilliantly addresses this whole transhumanist quest for immortality and seemingly infinite knowledge through the use of AI. So we're going to follow along in his conversation here. We're going to add some commentary, and my hope is always to generate meaningful conversation along the way. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that I'm here. Let's get into it.
The main drivers of AI, and particularly the transhumanist branch of it, are atheists, and that has been noticed by many people. That doesn't mean there are no Christians or theists working in artificial intelligence, but the things that are hitting the headlines, like the book of Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus, these people are atheistic, and so they're continuing the crusade, if we can call it that, of Richard Dawkins, in a slightly different area.
You know, it's interesting to think about this in the context of new atheism and even just kind of like the culture war behind that of like, what was it about? What was it happening in maybe the religious circles? I don't tend to like that, but for my context, you know, I'm involved in a Christian community, the Christian church, and I wonder what ground has been given up culturally, because when I hear the message of the gospel, it brings a lot of hope. And what I see in culture is a lot of hopelessness. And yet in the midst of that cultural shift, there was this new atheist movement that somehow, like, at least in my mind, doesn't bring the hope that it seemed like culture was craving. I see it in the church, I see it in the gospel, and yet it wasn't translated out into the mainstream culture very well. Now, maybe that's because you're swimming against the stream. There are other forces in this world. It's not just news anchors and media corporations. There are spiritual forces at work that are going to be antithetical to the church and to the message of the gospel. And I think maybe that is something that the church has just sort of not really considered. It would be very convenient if a bunch of Christian people were to just assume that any of the spiritual woo-woo stuff in the Bible was just like too strange to really pay attention to, and they sort of went to sleep in that area. So interesting sort of framing here to bring the conversation up into the current time, where we're really wondering about AI and what this might do for humanity. And of course, there's a whole group of people that are going to say that this is going to make humanity into gods, which is, well, let's just get into it more, I guess.
But yes, it's very much the same thing.
Well, you mentioned Harari, and we add him to the list of characters that made up the so-called new atheist, guys like the aforementioned Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and now we add Harari. And we talked about Harari briefly in part one of this interview. Let's revisit him because Harari has made some rather outrageous assertions, and one of them is the fact that he claims that AI, artificial intelligence, has the power to make us gods. Let's listen to this brief excerpt from an interview that he did.
Definitely check the links in the description of this video. I will provide the links of these different interviews. John Lennox is just a charming man. I really appreciate John Lennox. So anything that he's done is really worth checking out. But his debate with Dawkins is fascinating too. So maybe I'll leave that as well.
And then the next question that the book Homo Deus asks is, what next? So if we have solved, or we are in the process of solving these problems, what will we do with ourselves in the next century or two? And the book suggests that the next big projects of humankind will be to overcome old age and death, to find the keys, the secret to happiness, and to basically upgrade humans into gods. This is why the title Homo Deus, God-man.
This is not a new idea, right? This is, anybody that's coming at this from biblical Christian worldview will kind of pick up on the fact that this is new framing for a very old, very ancient idea that we could become like God. This is Genesis chapter 3. The serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day that you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So you catch the actual lie here? The serpent is telling Eve that she will eat of this and become like God. Eve was already made in the image of God. Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. They didn't need to add anything or do anything to become like God. Now, the transhumanists are going even one step further into the sort of Tower of Babel region and saying, well, we can be God. We can sort of replace God with ourselves. But it's interesting that embedded in that idea of humanity becoming God is always immortality, because that was the fruit of the tree that we didn't eat from. Humanity ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and then God prevented humanity from eating the fruit of the tree of life. There's another path to immortality, and yet humanity in rebellion to God is trying to find that path on their own. Homo Deus, God-man. Interesting. The sort of ignorance and hubris, I don't know which one comes first. I guess it's hubris that comes first, and then ignorance is exposed after that in at least this little clip here is pretty fascinating.
And I don't mean it as a kind of literary metaphor. I mean it in the literal sense that for thousands of years, humans have imagined gods in a particular way. They ascribed particular abilities and qualities to gods. And we are here in a church, and the walls are full of these descriptions of what God can do.
This is ironic that they're in a church. Again, going back to the idea of the cultural war and what ground did the sort of biblical theist, and again, that's my perspective, so I don't want to, I frame it that way because that's where I feel comfortable speaking from. I can't speak for any other religious sort of group, but this is this is a symbol of what has happened culturally as we give up ground. This whole conversation about humanity becoming God is actually happening in a church. See, again, there's more to this than just ideas. Ideas are powerful, but there are other forces at work in human history, through human history. And maybe the fact that this conversation is happening in a church is a clue to that.
And we are now seriously in the business of acquiring these traditional divine abilities and qualities to ourselves, whether it's trying to overcome death and gain immortality, or whether it's gaining the ability to create and design life according to our wishes. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, basically the first thing God does is to create animals and plants and humans according to his wishes. We are now trying to gain this divine ability to ourselves. It's very likely that in the 21st century, the main product, the most important products of the human economy will no longer be just vehicles and textiles and food and weapons. The main products will be bodies and brains and minds.
Bodies and brains and minds being viewed as a product or a commodity is super spooky. And that's why we're going to get to C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, because Lewis sort of predicted this. But I just wanted to sort of pause it right there, because when we get to Lewis, what he just said, hopefully will make more sense.
And in a way, we are even reaching beyond what ancient religions ascribed to the gods. Because the gods, like Jehovah in the Bible, they could create only organic beings. If you're a creationist and you look at the world, so all these animals, all these plants, God created them, and they are all organic.
Okay. So he is right there exposing his bias because he's very clearly wrong. And anybody who's actually just read the Bible honestly knows that God didn't just create organic life. God created spirit. There's all kinds of things that God can do that's beyond creating organic life. But you see, he betrays his bias right here by saying that the God of the Bible can only create organic life. What he's saying is spirit isn't a thing. He's disregarding the spiritual creation. He's disregarding the spiritual nature of reality, and that is a very dangerous thing to do. And Lewis points it out, and actually Doug Wilson in his lecture on Lewis does a great job of illustrating this. So again, this is from C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, which I would highly recommend reading right now. If you haven't read it already, now's the time.
Meantime, the evil party has been communing with quote-unquote macrobes, which are actually demons, which are actually evil spirits, which are actually devils, and they've succeeded in keeping the head of a guillotined prisoner alive, from whom they received their directives.
Brains and bodies become products.
They began this pursuit believing themselves to be men of reason and objective science, but they end by throwing themselves headlong into necromancy, which is communication with the dead using evil magic.
And so you have these transhumanists coming at this, having disregarded the spiritual reality, thinking that they're doing science, but what they're actually doing is witchcraft. What they're actually doing is necromancy. And the danger there is communing with spirits that you don't know exist. You think you're doing one thing, but what you're actually doing another. And ancient people actually had an advantage to modern people, modern secular people, because at least ancient people knew that they were communing with the spirits. So, our modern, the danger of these modern secularists is right in front of us. It's right in front of us. The idea that the God of the Bible only created material, only created biological things, is a betrayal that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know that there's a spiritual world out there. They have disregarded that. That's a bunch of hoopla. That's a bunch of woo-woo nonsense. And that is dangerous. So we kind of get back into Lennox here.
Wow. So here we have Yuval Noah Harari saying we will have divine abilities. What's your reaction, John?
Well, the first person to suggest that human beings could become gods was a talking snake inspired by the devil, and according to Genesis. That ought to make us slightly leery when we find Harari suggesting the very same thing. This is a very ancient idea, the notion that human beings can become gods, and one notices that Harari means it literally. Of course, it's off the scale in terms of speculation, because we don't know, for example, we don't actually know anything about, or very little about, the nature of consciousness. So we're not going to be able to create consciousness. Scientists can't build something unless they know exactly what it is.
And the interesting point here is that when you think of AI, are we giving AI too much credit? I mean, AI sort of gathers information. This is very like Enlightenment rationalism. Like we're sort of like the reductionist approach is like, well, we're just thinking machines, so we can just create other thinking machines. But we're certainly more than thinking machines. And Lennox I just love this guy, but we don't actually know what consciousness is. We can theorize what consciousness is, but the idea that you have created an artificial sort of intelligence or an artificial consciousness, we're thinking far too highly of our own abilities, and we're being far too reductionistic when it comes to like, what is a human being? What is consciousness? Because AIs are doing a great job of gathering information, sorting information. But again, humanity is more than just a thinking machine.
And so I fear that there's an enormous amount of hype here. Now, what people can do to a certain extent, they can simulate certain aspects of human beings and create those in robots, etc. And artificial intelligence can do lots of things, but as we discussed last time, an AI system normally does one thing that requires human intelligence. We're nowhere near the kind of thing Harari is talking about.
The other thing about that is, we are made to create. We're supposed to create things. So I'm not necessarily I wouldn't even approach this from like a anti-AI thing. I just think we need to fully understand it. I think Lennox's point that this is overhyped is a really good one. It's a very sober approach to the conversation. And I think in the context of how humanity has been created, the way I believe that God has created humanity in God's image. And so we're to steward creation and be co-creators with God. So it's very important that if we do this, we do it as an act of worship. We do it as an act of obedience and service to our Creator, not as an act of self-defiance of our Creator, because that's Babel, that's Nimrod, and we'll get into that. But again, it's sort of dangerous there.
And the huge barrier, as I see it, is consciousness. And of course, Harari is one voice. There are many other voices who think that this is absolute hype. And his notion that he's going to solve the problem of death as a technical medical problem and solve the problem of aging and all the rest of it. There are very strong scientific voices to say that he's in cloud cuckoo land, actually.
Well, you anticipate my next question, which is, he not only says that we will have the ability to create life, he says we will have the ability that goes beyond that of Jehovah, beyond that of the God of the Bible. We will have abilities that exceed that of the gods.
And I wonder too if, and this is one of the annoying parts about creating content like this, is I just interrupted John Lennox as he's about to say something that's far more brilliant than anything I'm about to say. But the reason that the transhumanists believe that we can exceed the power or the ability of God or the gods is because they have a small view of God. They think when Christian theists bring up the idea of God, we're just bringing up some sort of imagined God. We're talking about a God who is infinite in power, infinite in knowledge, and we couldn't even scratch the surface of that. Like, we would need God to reveal himself to us to even have the idea of an infinite God, because we're finite in our capacity to think, to imagine. And so it's very easy to think that humanity could exceed the ability of God when you have a small view of God. And that's, I think, kind of what they're doing.
Yes, but you notice the mistake. There's an error in what he says. He said God only created organic beings. That's false. According to Scripture, God himself is not an organic being. God is spirit. And he created spirit beings. We often call them angels or demons. And human beings are bipartite at least. In other words, they're flesh and spirit. So on that very important point, he's wrong. So to say we can go beyond God and create beings that are not tied to biology as we understand it is simply false. And then there's a question of going beyond. That seems to imply that there's a superiority in the idea of unhitching the human mind, for instance, from a biological base. And the reasons for that, of course, are that our bodies degenerate and we die. And Harari doesn't like that. So he wants to solve that, as he calls it, the technical problem. There's just so much wild speculation here. And I'm afraid that I feel a lot of it is sheer hubris, and it fits absolutely into the notion that has tracked humanity all through history, and that is the desire to be God. And the initial scenario in the Garden of Eden was where God forbade one particular fruit. And the idea there was that humans were moral beings. And what was insinuated into their minds was that really, if you disobey this, you will rise in the hierarchy of being and you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. And there a huge mistake is made by many writers. They say God is against knowledge. It wasn't the tree of knowledge that was forbidden to them. It was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it turned out that that's the very thing that you do not want to have. So there are many things playing out here, but the basic one, that human desire to be God that we saw in the pharaohs, that we saw in many Assyrian and Babylonian emperors, and of course, even in more recent times. So I'm pretty pessimistic about I don't think he's going to reach that, because what he's talking about are things that are completely imponderable to science as yet. Remember, Harari's not a scientist, Larry. He is a historian, and he is responding to, well, he's using a pretty fertile imagination to join this hyped up transhumanist agenda that we're going to go beyond the human. Now, it has got all kinds of problems associated with it, but we can go into those as we get to them.
He's really even not much of a historian, John. He's a bit of what might be called a futurist, a P.T. Barnum kind of character. We must remember that in that particular interview, he's promoting and selling his book, God Man, and that's a major part of, you refer to it as hype. I think that's the appropriate word because, we're discussing him. He's selling books. He's getting what he wants out of that.
And who is he serving then? You cannot serve God and mammon. So mammon is actually the spiritual force behind at least the selling of the book that's about transhumanism. Not unlike how much money Richard Dawkins made when he wrote The God Delusion. So he certainly has a vested interest in promoting the idea of atheism or promoting the idea of transhumanism, because there's financial gains to be had. And so are they serving science? Are they serving history? Are they serving humanity? Or are they serving mammon? They're serving the god of wealth.
This leads to an interesting discussion about the soul, something that's missed in all of this. You were talking about it's not really even clear what would be uploaded, to a machine, since we don't really know what consciousness is. Is it just, the contents of the brain, our knowledge, a personality that's uploaded? What of the soul? What of the soul? How does the soul figure in to the discussion of immortality and transhumanism?
We are certainly in the realm where human beings are not purely material, and I will go further than that. Their soul, whatever it is, or their spirit, is not an epiphenomenon, is not an emergent property of their physical bodies. It's something else. So in that sense, I would be very happy by being called a dualist. In other words, I can say to you, Larry, I'm getting old. My body is not in good shape. Now, that body is something that is not I. The I that says my body is not in good shape cannot just be that body. There's a transcendence even within human beings. And it seems to me this is consistent with what the Bible is saying.
I wonder what, I'm not familiar enough with John Vervaeke, but I know that sounds very like Vervaeke-ish as far as what I know of, like there is more even just to consciousness than we realize. And for me, I wonder what you guys think about this, which is, the soul is a makeup of multiple things. Socrates talked about the mind, the appetites, the will, and the spirited nature, the thing that causes you to get up and dance, when you hear music. So there is this. Human nature is far more complex than the reductionist materialist could imagine, because they've confined their parameters to just the biological. And so the way John Lennox thinks, I find to be so refreshing, because he just gives you a very clear illustration. If I say, I'm not feeling well, my body is not feeling well, the person speaking is more than just the body. And so, I don't know, like, what's the drive there to reduce humanity just to the biological? I mean, I guess that is the appetitive nature is very strong. And I think even Socrates would propose the idea that the wisdom, the mind part of the person and the spirited part of the person needs to unite in order to overcome the appetitive nature, our desires, our drives that are sort of tied to biology. Usually this is food and sex, the table and the bed. Those are the things that kind of like move us to, create wars and try to like overcome, other, tribes and stuff like that, because of access to food or access to, whatever. And so, so maybe there's something to that. There's some sort of like appetitive part of our human nature that is wanting to overcome human consciousness and wanting to overcome sort of spirit, to just reduce humanity down into the biological. I don't know. What do you think about that? It's an interesting kind of thing, interesting observation, I guess, to make.
Let's go back just a bit, because I don't want to make assumptions that everyone who's listening to us knows exactly what we're talking about here. Define for us transhumanism.
Oh, transhumanism is a movement, really. And Harari is at the heart of it. Nick Bostrom in Oxford is one of the leading players. And the idea is that it's going beyond the human in exactly the ways that Harari was saying in that clip, going beyond the human in different ways. First method that is being actively researched is to upgrade humans. He uses that word. And that can be done either by implants of various kinds of technology. And he talks about our smartphones eventually becoming part of ourselves and so on. Human capacities can be enhanced by drugs. That's another way of doing it. But research on transhumanism, so to speak, to move beyond the human, is either enhancing existing humans, or the much more speculative thing is, as you were referring to it earlier, starting from scratch on a base that is non-organic, probably silicon or something like this, and building something that can contain but go way beyond the capacities, all the capacities of a normal human being.
Well, and so so there's a way in which this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, like, I know it's spooky, but like, again, we are co-creators. So we're meant to create things. And so we're creating machines, we're creating robots. And the idea would be, well, could we upload human consciousness onto these robots or something like that? That to me maybe goes a little bit too far. That's a little Jeff Goldblum in, Jurassic Park. We're so concerned with the question of what can we do that we're not asking what should we do. And again, this sort of takes me back to C.S. Lewis and the danger there of, are you really uploading human consciousness, or are you doing necromancy? Are you engaged with the spirits? Because in that book, what happens is, in order to get the human head to talk, it has to be possessed by a spirit. So there's something weird going on in the realm of, I just did a live stream where we talked about digital community versus digital spirits, and the idea of like maybe the ancient spirits that have been disembodied. This is one of the theories about Genesis chapter 6 and the flood, is that these Nephilim died in the flood and their spirits still sort of roam the earth. And what would they be looking for? Well, they're looking for bodies. They're looking to possess something so that they can take form and sort of rule the earth again, or whatever. Of course, that's theory, that's speculation, but certainly seems like it's possibly on the table. So we don't want to run the risk of creating bodies for spirits to inhabit. Anyway, the other thing that's interesting here is that when so Harari writes the book The Rise of Homo Deus, God-man. Now, he doesn't believe in God, which is so funny, right? You're still trapped in the language. But you're still trapped in the world that God created. And so he doesn't come up with another idea of like Homo alien, Homo just create something else. But he has to try and there's something there, right? Because if God doesn't exist, why would humanity want to become God? Why would humanity want to become a thing that doesn't exist? So he's coming from a secular framework, but he's borrowing the Christian worldview, or at least, again, I speak from a Christian worldview. He's borrowing from a religious, theological worldview to even write the title for his book. So if you're familiar with Paul Vanderklay, his project is to identify where sort of Jesus smuggling is going on in the secular world, and maybe that's one of those places where the Jesus smuggling has been going on.
Now, let's factor the Christian message into this, because it helps us to clear the contours of what is going on. And let's contrast it with Harari's promise. Harari says we're going to solve the problem of death, and we're going to enhance human beings and turn them into gods. Now, firstly, he's too late. The problem of physical death was solved when God raised Christ from the dead. Now, this is crucial in the debate when we're looking at it in the wide picture, the wide lens that the Bible gives us. Secondly, the idea of uploading. We just have to change the words very slightly and we get a biblical concept, because Christ promised that anybody who repented of the mess they'd made of their lives, and possibly lives of others, sin we call it, and trusted him as Savior, would one day be uploaded. In other words, they would be raised from the dead, even as Jesus was. And what is very interesting here is that after death dimension has a bodily aspect to it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is just so good. Lennox, and this is why I think that John Lennox needs to go on Joe Rogan, because he's not necessarily interested in debate. He really is just charming. He's very conversational, and he has a strong sense of irony here. He's like these transhumanists. Hey guys, you're doing a great job. You're just 2,000 years too late. Like Jesus got to it before you, but within that, there's kind of a profound point, right? Because now what we're talking about is just an antichrist. This has become one of those things where it's like, what is the antichrist? Someone who looks like Christ, tries to promise the things that Christ promises, but is ultimately antithetical to the actual person of Christ. So the irony there is just so fascinating. And then again, the resurrection. So it's like the resurrection of Jesus was a physical resurrection. He touched on kind of Gnosticism earlier, kind of the emphasis of the mind at the expense of the body, the de-emphasis of the body. And so when Christ is raised physically, the Gnostics would say, no, because remember, we don't like the body. This world, we're not interested in that. We're interested in unlocking clues to secret knowledge that would elevate us into this hierarchy of being. And in order to do that, we need to leave the body behind. And yet when Christ is raised, he still has his scars, if you think about that. His resurrected heavenly form still has the scars of his crucifixion. So it is a body, and he eats fish, and he hangs out with his disciples. Yeah, like now he also teleports here and there, so it's different. But C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce talks about a world that is more real than this world. That's heaven. That's actually one of the last podcast episodes we did with Jordan Peterson and kind of the apocalypse. That some people unfortunately have a view that the biblical Christian idea of heaven is this ethereal place, non-physical place, but it's actually more real than this world. It's a resurrected world. And so I just find, again, the irony. John Lennox, the wisdom of John Lennox is that this is humorist. And now that argument, if you want to call it an argument, is that much more powerful because he has very winsomely and charmingly pointed out the irony of this whole transhumanist movement.
God hasn't done with the idea of body. He hasn't become a Greek philosopher of the kind who thought that matter was evil. And the most important thing is to disengage from matter. And partly, I suspect this lies behind, kind of Gnosticism lies behind the transhuman agenda. No, God is going to raise our bodies, but they're going to be different. And they are not going to be liable to suffering and pain and death and all this kind of thing. So the question you raise is going to be answered not by abolishing body, but by giving us a different body. That is, if we're prepared to trust Christ. So that there is an answer to the question, but it's not the answer people either expect, and it's not the answer many people want to hear. Because, of course, it involves a thing that many of these people, in common with the new atheists who preceded them, are not prepared to face. And that is the flaw in human nature as such, that we call sin. The fact that we have fallen and disobeyed God, and that needs to be dealt with.
Well, and putting your faith and trust and hope in Christ is an act of humility. And it does seem that one of the driving forces behind sort of transhumanism and new atheism is hubris. It's extreme pride to say, one, that we could become gods, but also to say, well, we know that there is no God. That's just pride. The humble person can do better thinking because you remain teachable. And so you can do better philosophy, you can do better theology when you remain teachable. But when you approach the whole subject as though you know, then your pride gets in the way and you're blind to the truth that's in front of you.
And Harari is trying to create a utopia and bypass the problem of human sin. It cannot be done. The Germans tried to do it, the Nazis during World War II, and before it, the Russians tried to do it to create a new man, and they had very little technology available. And the net result of those attempts to create the pure Aryan or the communist new man in Russia was simply a river of blood. And I just fear that the current attempt, if we're not careful, may end up in exactly the same quarter.
The transhumanists that someone like Yuval Noah Harari would represent are repeating that very same thing. There is immortality to be had. It is offered to humanity in the person of Jesus Christ. But having rejected that, they say, no, we want to create it ourselves. We want to sit on that throne.
And again, when you've reduced everything to just matter, your hope is in the material world. Your hope is in extending biological life. And yet the hope that we have in Christ is the inverse of that. It's that the hope goes beyond this world into eternity. And so we don't have to look at death with fear. We mourn, but not like those who are without hope. We have a great hope. The unfortunate thing for sort of the transhumanists and the atheists is that the only hope that they have is in this material world and extending that material world out, which is almost like doubly tragic because this world has a lot of pain and suffering. So you really want that to last forever? Nah, not interested. That's the fairy tale that I don't want to have to believe in.
And so they're seeking to create immortality via other means.
Yes. It's a Babel project. And as such, it will fail because there's no moral dimension to it.
He said that this is the project of the Tower of Babel. That's what he said. This is the Babel project.
That's very noticeable. It has no moral dimension. And that, of course, in another context, is one of the great problems of artificial intelligence. But people find this kind of thing attractive. You see, we mentioned earlier that Harari is a historian, but there are very serious scientists saying this kind of thing. Our astronomer royal, who's a brilliant man, Lord Martin Rees, is saying exactly the same thing. And he expects that in the future, it won't be humans that take over the world. And it will be some kind of product that we have created. And there's a big danger there, of course, as well, because C.S. Lewis, whom you mentioned in the introduction, Larry, was prescient in being very leery of the idea of a group of boffins altering life and creating life and reducing life to a head, a physical head. There's his famous book, That Hideous Strength, that imagines this in all its gruesome detail. And his summary, which he wrote in 1940 in his book, The Abolition of Man, was that what will be made will be an artifact. And he has this chilling statement: the final triumph of humanity will be the abolition of man.
Yeah, that is sort of chilling that all of these projects that we're engaging with will end up really undermining humanity itself, which again takes me back to the fact that there are other forces at work. Because again, just like why, if you don't believe in God, why entitle your book God Man, and yet through all of our attempts to save humanity, we're actually destroying humanity. That again tells me that there are other forces at work. So this is where we kind of land the plane, and we get into an interpretation of Genesis 11 that I could use some help. I could use some discussion on this. I've got some ideas that I think are helpful now. The whole earth used the same language and the same words. That's where we are. Like this, the digital world is a one language world. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in Shinar and settled there and said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Now this goes into pyramids and all kinds of other stuff, which is really fun stuff. But they used the bricks for stone and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city," Cain, "and a tower whose top will reach heaven." Okay, this is humanity ascending into the heavenly realm. Not with God, just humanity beginning from ourselves. And then it says this, and let us make for ourselves a name. This is really interesting. What are they actually making for themselves? Now, is this just pride, which a lot of people would say God, scattered the people of Babel because pride. Now, this takes us to the whole conversation of transhumanism and the new atheism and just the hubris that's there. I think pride is certainly a part of our interpretation of the Tower of Babel. But I don't think it's the whole story. What are they actually making? It says, make a name for ourselves. This word is interesting. It could mean that they're leaving a mark. This is where I need some help here. But I think the main point is that they are the ones making. Let us make for ourselves. Let us make for ourselves. The people of Babel are the ones doing the making. And that is where, again, this ties into the transhumanist movement and all this. It's an old story playing out in kind of new framing, if you will. And so God scatters the people, and I talked about this in the Giants from Genesis to Revelation video. I will make sure that is linked at the end here. I'll make sure it's in the comments or in the description of this video. And I think that out of all the videos that I've made recently, that one was the one that felt the most original. I was doing the most of my own thinking, and I really think people miss some of this whole story that has been going on from the beginning. What we are experiencing today is not necessarily new, and we need to know how to navigate kind of the new trappings, the new setting, the new utensils, the new tools that are being used to really recreate this same story. Let us make. We're going to make it. We're not going to allow Yahweh to transform us. We're not going to allow Yahweh to redeem us and provide immortality and provide the infinite wisdom that Yahweh has. No, we were going to make this for ourselves. And ultimately, that's the end, right? If we could get humanity to destroy, to make themselves into gods, then they would destroy themselves. And that's why John Lennox brings up the C.S. Lewis quote in Abolition of Man: the final triumph of humanity will be the abolition of man. Humanity, beginning from itself, will self-destruct. So that's why we need to cling to God, the only person who can save us and rescue us during this time, that can allow us to discern through all the deception, is the Spirit of God, the helper who comes to lead us to all truth. So I hope that's encouraging for you. Again, I would check out that Giants from Genesis to Revelation video, because I do think that is super helpful, and I will catch you in the next one.